Hey y'all. So we're going to jump into a new section of class about logic. We're going to go through logic in kind of a brief overview sort of way to give you a foothold with it and to help you as you do research and just in your life and throughout college. Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. Right? This theme of examining your life, of developing a worldview, has been a theme in this class because not only do I think it's part of rhetoric, but rhetoric being a humanities and being a liberal art means that it's part of life too, right? Examining your life, examining your beliefs, thinking deeply about things is all crucial. It's all crucial. And again, it's relevant for this class specifically because it's crucial to just becoming a good writer, right? The great writers that we read have a worldview. They're not just repeating the same things everyone else is. They have a worldview that's complete and that they can articulate incredibly well. This idea of bias then comes up. It's probably come up, I think, in the library module. It comes up whenever people talk about research and things like that. Um, Bias is an interesting thing. It's difficult to talk about. Um, it's everywhere. It's everywhere, and we all have biases, right? From relatively innocent biases, like I prefer Mediterranean food over Italian food. I really like Greek food. I really like Mediterranean food, and I'm allergic to gluten, so Italian food doesn't sit right with me. And so I have kind of a bias toward it, you could say. So obviously, when people talk about bias, they're talking typically about worse things, right? Things that we hopefully don't have, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and so on and so forth. At the same time, there are some flaws to us thinking about our biases, right? They're very difficult to identify. Certainly, if you have a bias, it's very hard to be aware of what it is. They've developed tests to try, at least they did back when I was middle school, high school, college. Bias tests were kind of becoming a thing and were a thing at that time. I think they've faded away a little bit. But those were very flawed as well, in the sense that people would have different answers if they took it multiple times. And if they had different answers, it's like, well, is this really testing something that's real and solid or not? Similarly, a bias is essentially your like first thought, your immediate reaction to something. And there's a question of whether or not you should really be judged for your first reaction to something, right? Sometimes we have a bad reaction immediately, but then we take a step back, we get a little perspective, and we take then the proper thought and the proper action afterwards. So it's kind of weird to be judged off your first thought, your initial reaction, your knee-jerk sort of response to something. There's also the question of like who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what your bias is and why it's bad and like judge you for it? So bias is a strange thing, and again, it's everywhere, right? A big thing people talk about a lot now is that the universities are biased toward the left, which is probably true, but even our tendency to see things right and left exclusively is itself a bias. If you think about it, it's a weird, very American, maybe very Western way of seeing things in terms of left or right, traditional or progressive, conservative or liberal. Right. As I say here, that originates in the French Revolution when the progressive element sat on the left hand side, the element for religion and king, right, one to conserve the way things were, sat on the right hand side, and people caught in between sat in the center. So that's where that kind of idea of that spectrum even comes from. But it's colored our worldview ever since. Um, yeah, Chesterton has this great quote here where he says, "The whole modern world has divided itself into conservatives and progressives. The business of progressives is to go on making mistakes. The business of conservatives is to prevent mistakes from being corrected. Even when the revolutionist might himself repent of his revolution, the traditionalist is already defending it as part of his tradition. Thus, we have two great types: the advanced person who rushes us into ruin, and the retrospective person who admires the ruins. Um, so it's kind of this weird way that we see everything, is what he's pointing out here, that this thing is kind of unusual, um, and is also a moving target, right? The progressive revolution one day becomes kind of the conservative nostalgia. Oh, remember the revolution, right? Which again is why also the political spectrum is kind of a moving target. It's always kind of moving. Um, a conservative in the 80s might not recognize his party now. A progressive in the 80s might not recognize their party now. Um, what I want to say, what I'm trying to get at here, is that bias comes from our worldview. A way to think about bias is that it's the natural intuitions we develop about the world that come from our more higher level worldview type thinking, our means of perception, our means of perceiving things. And so you will always have, in a sense, a bias. But if your bias, if your intuition from your worldview is to think the correct thing, well, that's good, right? And so the idea of bias then I'm trying to get at is you actually need to develop a worldview still. You need to develop a worldview. The worldview is going to inform your biases. Then your biases might not become negative, they might become good. They're good intuitions that you have about things. So you need to develop your worldview. You need to learn how to think. Right? Everyone has this worldview. I'm going through this fast because we've talked about this a lot in this class. But just ideas kind of have chains, they have consequences, right? Um, they're predicated upon other ideas, right? If you have a political idea, a question, or an idea about how society ought to be structured, that usually rests on an ethical idea, which is how people should behave or treat others, which usually rests on an anthropological idea of like what is human nature, right? Which are predicated on metaphysical ideas, which means like what even is reality itself, right? And where do people fit in that reality? And all that's bound up in ideas about like how do we know what we know? As an illustration of this, great thinkers of the past usually have thought through these sort of levels of things, right? Karl Marx is a really good example, I think. Again, this is oversimplified, or at least very simplified, but to give us an idea of these chains. So Marx thought that God and spiritual ideas didn't exist. To him, only matter existed. So this concept of reality that only matter exists. He then has this anthropological idea. If only matter exists, people are only matter. They don't have like a spirit or like a character or a soul, right? They are simply their material circumstances, which to him means their economic circumstances, right? So if people are only their economic circumstances, they're the only way you can talk about people is with regards to their economic class. That's why Marxists will talk about the bourgeoisie, the proletariat. Um, you know, in Marx, there's no concept that a rich person could be good or a poor person could be evil. Um, People are simply their social class, their economic class. This has political implications. This is what people tend to focus on, right? The political implication is that the proletariat, the poor people, should rise up and overthrow the rich people in a violent revolution to create a utopia where there's only a single class. Okay? Um, so that's kind of just an example of ideas affecting other ideas. Um, Obviously, Marx is someone who has explicitly thought through these ideas. You can find all those things in his writings. And again, that's highly simplified. I mean, the guy wrote thousands of pages. That's not a simplified version. But we all do this, whether or not we can explicitly name those ideas. And if we aren't aware of what our ideas are, it's probably, like I've said many times, it's probably because we've accepted what has been given us, which is fine. But you're getting to this point now where you will have to start to think for yourself in a really true way and develop your own ideas, right? Where most of us are stuck at the tip of this iceberg, most of us are stuck on this political or cultural level. Um, by politics, just mean like social laws, customs, culture. I mean the way people are, the way people live their lives within our civilization. Um, that's where most of us are stuck at, and even the essay prompt itself, as I say here, is sort of biased toward this. The essay prompt is to fix something. It's to find something broken and fix it, which is again, it's kind of this progressive idea, um, which I tried to balance out by making you think about the history of the thing, which is more of like a conservative idea. But even more than that, I don't want you thinking about it in that left right spectrum. I want you to be able to start thinking about, well, is this true or is it false? Regardless of where it falls on the left right spectrum. Is it up? Is it true? Or is it down? Is it false? Right? I don't need to go through this again, but again, the cave, right? Ideologue, etc. Um, But because we're stuck at this level, right, we're left just shouting at each other about rights and shouting political slogans. Um, and one of the reasons we're going to start talking about logic in just a second here, I've been rushing through this intro a little bit because it's things I've said a lot before in this class. But one of the reasons I think now is the time to talk about logic is even research as a concept is highly flawed, especially if you don't know logic. Um, the research and what you're going to be doing is you're going to be making an argument, and you're going to be backing up your argument with what was once called an appeal to authority. You're appealing to an authority on the topic to strengthen your argument. Logically speaking, these appeals to authority were considered the weakest type of logical argument. Even in the Middle Ages, right? People think of the Middle Ages and it's like, well, they were all just like Bible thumping. They just like said whatever the Bible said. Um, Ironically, in the Middle Ages is when, at the university level, if you appealed to like the Bible, that was considered a very weak argument. You actually had to prove your arguments logically. You see this kind of thing in most famously Aquinas, right, where he he will lay out his opponent's argument, he'll lay out his argument all on a highly logical level without referencing the Bible, uh, or only very rarely referencing the Bible, even though he himself is a Catholic monk, right? That was the standard back then. The point being, now that logical foundation of argument has been taken from us. It's been removed from our education. We typically don't have it. If you didn't take this specific class with me, I'm not sure you would even be introduced to this idea in another rhetoric class. Maybe in some, but not necessarily in others. It's not a requirement. It's something I'm deciding to do because I think it's really important. Um, Again, if you haven't learned to think logically, you can't think your way through your research. You'll probably just find things that you agree with and use them. and you'll find things you disagree with, and they'll frustrate you, and you'll get maybe mad reading them, get upset, and you won't use them, or you'll use them just to like make fun of them or to criticize them or something. Right? That idea even of like, oh well, you look at both sides, has basically no value if you can't actually logically discern what's true or false or mere opinion, right? You'll just be locked into your preconceived idea of the thing, and not be able to make that discernment. Just as a quick aside, just because I think this is interesting, um, you see worldview come through in stories, right? Another way of thinking about worldview is thinking about what story we tell ourselves about our life. As Alistair McIntyre said, it is through hearing stories about wicked stepmothers, lost children, good but misguided kings, youngest sons who receive no inheritance but must make their way in the world, and eldest sons who waste their inheritance on riotous living and go into exile to live with the swine, that children learn or mislearn both what a child and what a parent is, what the cast of characters may be in the drama into which they have been born, and what the ways of the world are. Right? So stories present a worldview, right? Stories are present a perception about the way the world works and the way the world is, which I talk about in my leave of absence presentations a little more. It's why we fight about this type of stuff a lot, about like children's literature, um, what entertainment should be allowed, what shouldn't be allowed. It's because of this. It's because it presents a worldview. And just for some examples of that, this can be seen most clearly in the stories that we repeat. Uh, the changes, the differences in those stories tell us a lot about culture. For example, The Little Mermaid, the original Hans Christian Andersen. In that story, the Little Mermaid becomes human in spite of protests from like her father and things. She's mute, and the prince actually falls in love with someone else who's not Ursula, who's not like a supervillain, just falls in love with another human being. And at the end of that story, the Little Mermaid sacrifices her own life to actually save the life of the woman Eric loves. Um, and she was essentially basically realizes she loves Eric so much that she wants what's best for him in spite of her own feelings on it. So it's this story about like self-sacrifice and love and things like that, learning one's place in the world. Whereas the new Little Mermaid is about finding yourself, finding love, romantic love, in spite of everything, not listening to like what other people say, right? Especially your dad. There's a difference there, right? Our culture, the cultural difference comes through there. Few more examples. There's interesting, just to kind of prove this point. The Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, is about marriage, importance of marriage, the importance of home, right? Odysseus literally leaves paradise with a goddess for eternity to go back home to his like 50 whatever year old wife because he loves her, because family and marriage and stuff is really important in that story. Um, in Ulysses by Tennyson, um, Odysseus decides family and my wife and being a king, that's all actually really stifling. I'm actually going to go out and keep exploring and like find myself and like do what I want to do, right? It's like self-expression, right? Again, we see how the world changed from the ancient world to the Romantic era, which kind of is a precursor to our era in a lot of the things that it thinks. Book of Genesis, obviously, the first part's about God creating mankind and mankind falling to evil with original sin and separating mankind from God. The Talos Principle, which is a great video game, really fun puzzle video game. It's a retelling of that story, the Adam and Eve story, but with robots. And the point of the Talos Principle is that actually you choosing to sin, choosing to disobey God is actually what makes you human, right? So it's actually this total inversion of the idea of the biblical story. It's like actually sin is good because it proves you have free will, um, and other things besides that. So again, this kind of you see our new culture kind of coming through that retelling. Final example, um, yeah, Gawain and the Green Knight, the poem, the great poem from the Middle Ages, is about a knight who's trying to live a life of Catholic virtue. He goes to mass all the time. He's very humble. He's very meek. He's very chaste. He doesn't sleep with anyone. He doesn't sleep with like princess. That's like a big plot point in the story. Um, right, the new Green Knight, which just came out a few years ago, it's a movie. The very first scene, it's Christmas morning, and Gawain is at a brothel, which he visits regularly. And he wants to skip mass, right? And he kind of just has no moral backbone. So again, you see this like inversion of um, that Middle Ages sensibility in our own culture. There are a million other examples. I think like Bridgerton, if Jane Austen is about finding love and love being really complicated and being like personalities have to be right and social situation has to be right and finances have to be right. Like your families have to get along enough and like it's really complex finding true love in Jane Austen. In Bridgerton, it's like are you really physically compatible with that person? That's true love, right? Like it's that's kind of our new cultural norm. You see it coming through. Again, there's a million examples. This could really be its own semester-long class. The point is, like, worldview is a real thing. It has real effect, and it comes through everywhere, not just in politics, not just in your community, but in stories, in movies, in music, and so on and so forth. Okay, so you have to develop a worldview, and you have to learn how to think to be able to discern whether your worldview is correct or whether need to change things. Okay, so that's what we're going to jump into now. We're going to jump into the study of logic, right? Logic is learning how to think. I think I've beat the drum enough on the need to develop a worldview. Now, as you're doing your research project and you're really looking into things, you need to know how to think also in order to keep developing yourself and your ideas. So, we're going to study logic over the next maybe couple of weeks here or so. We're going to study it in a broad brief way, right? You could take a semester or a year or whatever of logic and probably not exhaust it. We're gonna do our best to get started. So logic is the study of the structure of human reasoning. It's the study of how one thinks properly, how one thinks correctly, how you know that the conclusion you've arrived at is true or as close to true as you can get it to be. And we can all reason. We all have that ability. It's a human ability, right? Um, though we all have, I think, different natural capacities for it, right? That's, IQ tests are really controversial. But that's one of the things that they're meant to study. They're meant to discern is like what your innate capacity for reasoning is. But you can increase your capacity to reason. You can become better at rational thinking by studying logic and by reading very logical stuff. Okay? So, broadly speaking, there are two kinds of logical structures: deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning reasons from a general principle to a specific conclusion. As Peter Kreeft says, deductive reasoning reasons from at least one general or universal premise, for example, all men are mortal, usually to a more particular conclusion. I am mortal, right? So all alligators are green. Bill is an alligator. Therefore, Bill is green, right? You can know that without seeing Bill, right? If that first premise is true, which I think there are like albino alligators or maybe the crocodiles. So that first premise might not be true, but you can see the structure. If all alligators are green, and if Bill is an alligator, then even without seeing Bill ever, right, you know that he must be green. Okay, that's how deductive reasoning works. You don't even have to ever see Bill. Bill is a figment of our imagination. But if those first two premises are true, then that conclusion must be true. Okay? For example, another example, all squares are rectangles. This is a square. Therefore, it is also a rectangle. Right? Again, you don't have to see the square. You don't have to see, like, if that first premise is true, that all squares are rectangles, and then you have a square, then it has to be a rectangle. There's no two ways about it, right? That's deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning goes the other way. It takes, instead of taking a principle that must be true, right, and then applying it to a specific instance to get a conclusion, inductive takes a bunch of specific instances and then tries to reason out a principle from those specific instances. So, for example, if I said, I am mortal, you're mortal, he's mortal, she's mortal, then I might conclude, therefore, all people are probably mortal, right? We do this type of reasoning all the time as well. For example, my first 3 dates with this guy were terrible, so I'm going to stop going out with him. That's inductive reasoning. You're saying, I've been on 3 dates, they were all bad, therefore, probably every date will be bad, and it will be a bad relationship. So I'm going to take action about that, right? You could be wrong. The 4th date could have been amazing. The person could have just been awkward or shy or not acting like themselves for whatever reason. And you could have ended up getting married and whatever, but you can't think like that. You have to use inductive. You have to go, you know what? I'm not going to persist in this. It's not going well. It's probably going to keep going poorly. Another example, I've liked every book by this author, so I'm going to buy her new book, right? Um, uh, the principle is just like, I like that book, I like that book, I like that book, so in conclusion, I'll probably like all of her books. So I'm gonna buy the newest one. That's inductive reasoning. Or you start realizing you break out in hives every time you eat shrimp. You're probably gonna go, you know what? I'm gonna reason out to a general principle, which is that I probably have some sort of allergy, and I'm gonna go get tested for it or whatever. Okay. So that's deductive versus inductive reasoning. Deduction is meant to yield 100% certainty, right? If the major premise is true and the logic is sound, then the conclusion has to be true, right? Again, all men are mortal. I am a man, therefore I am mortal, right? If it's true that all men are mortal, and it's true that I am a man, then it must be true that I am mortal. There's 100% certainty about that, right? Induction yields probability to varying degrees, right? If I said, I like cars, you like cars, she likes cars, probably everyone likes cars, right? It's like that might not be true, right? It's probably true. Certainly, it seems like everyone likes cars, but there are probably some people who don't or whatever, right? Anyway, it's not necessarily true. We at best with inductive reasoning get some, like, 99.9% certainty. But usually it's actually a lot less certain than that. A real life example that you see all the time are statistics or polling, right? Because what statistics or polling do is they take a small sample size. Let's say they poll 3,000 Americans about whether or not they like hamburgers, right? And um, out of that 3,000, 2,000 say that they do, and 1,000 say that they don't, right? So that's two-thirds like hamburgers. Then the poll will say, well, therefore, about two-thirds of Americans like hamburgers. Like, again, that's probably, more or less true. But you can see that it doesn't have certainty, right? What if you asked every single American and you really got a statistic, a poll that polled everyone, the the um the final number would probably be different than that, right? And again, obviously, you see this in political races, right, where the polls will say one thing, and then election day comes and it's different, and the polls were wrong, right? I mean, this happens all the time. It's because statistics and polls are inductive. They're using inductive reasoning. Um, if I surveyed 3 out of my 75 students, and I said, "Do you like the class?" And all three of them said yes. And then I just assumed, well, everyone must like the class. It's like, obviously that's really flawed, right? That's inductive. Uh, so yeah, we see kind of the difference here, I hope. And there are three rules then for an argument. We're mainly going to be talking about deductive arguments, but um, uh, there are three rules for deductive arguments. If these three things, these three requirements are met, then the argument must be true. So first, all the terms have to be clear and unambiguous. If a term is ambiguous, it should be defined to make it clear. Otherwise, the two parties may think they're talking about the same thing when they are not. Right? We're going to get into this next class, but an example would be like two people are talking. One person says, "Hey, are you a feminist?" And the other person says, "Yeah, I'm a feminist." And they both go, "Great, well then we're both feminists." But what if that one person talking about feminism meant just like being pro women, just being like, "Yeah, I think women are great, and can do things," and then the other person meant, the historical, philosophical set of ideas that makes up feminism proper. They're actually talking about two different things. Uh, uh, Even though they think they're talking about the same thing, right? This sort of, and obviously I showed two people agreeing, but this sort of agreement or disagreement happens all the time. All the time. It's one of the main reasons we can't have really good conversations and arguments and deep thinking is because we're often using words in different ways. Okay, so the terms have to be clear and unambiguous. Do you mean feminism just being pro-woman, or do you mean the specific set of philosophical ideas? And even in that, it's like there are, I think, 4 waves of feminism that kind of have significant differences with each other. So it's like, well, what do you even mean? Are you talking about just like first wave women's suffrage? Are you talking about like 60s feminine? Right? You have to clarify these things. Second, all the premises must be true. You can seem to prove anything from false premises. All Martians are infallible, and I'm a Martian, therefore I am infallible. That's actually logically valid, except that the premises, neither of those premises are true, right? Um, all Martians are infallible. There are no Martians, right? and then and so they can't actually have this quality of being right about everything they say, which is what infallible means. The second premise, I'm a Martian. Again, I'm not. I'm from planet Earth, right? So the premises have to actually correspond with reality, right? They have to be true. That's what true means, is that it corresponds with reality. Okay? And then the argument must be logically valid. It has to follow from the premises, so that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. For example, if I said all men are mortal, Bill is mortal, therefore he is a man, that's actually logically invalid, right? Because there are many things that are mortal besides just people, besides just human beings. And so to say Bill is mortal doesn't necessarily follow that he is therefore a human being, right? So again, all men are mortal, Bill is mortal, therefore he is a human being, is invalid. Where all men are mortal, Bill is a man, therefore he is mortal, is logically valid. Right? We're going to talk about these sorts of things as we go on, how that works. That's the difference. That's an example of the difference between proper and improper reasoning. Okay, so when you're constructing an argument or reading through an argument, the things you should be constantly asking yourself is, are all the terms clear and unambiguous? Right? And that's one of the reasons I had us do this definitions essay. And you all brought up, I think, largely some pretty interesting things. Words that are thrown around a lot that can mean many different things, right? And if you're reading something, or if you're listening to someone, and you're like, what do they mean by that word? That's a bad sign, right? Because if you don't know what the word means, then you can't possibly know if they're right or wrong, if what they're saying is true or false. Next, are all the premises true, right? Uh, Trying to think of a good premise, but yeah. So again, like that premise, all Martians are fallible, is obviously not true. Um, or if I said, all cats are gods, I am a cat, therefore I am a god. Well, um, I'm pretty sure that not all cats are gods. I'm pretty sure that's not true, though that might take some argument. Um, I know that I'm not a cat, right? Therefore, that's an invalid argument. It doesn't make sense. And then, is the reasoning logically valid, right? Um, Again, that example of all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a logical, if those two premises are true, that conclusion must be true. Whereas if I said all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man, that's invalid reasoning. You can't know that from those premises alone. Okay? And that's, in a nutshell, how logic works. So just to go through this really quickly, just get a feel for the difference between terms, um, propositions, and logical arguments. Everyone is a term, right? Everyone in America is also a term, right? It's one thing, it's one idea. Everyone in America and the rest of the world as well is also a term. It's also a term, right? I think, therefore, I am is a logical argument, right? You're saying there's this premise, and I'm moving from a premise to a conclusion. That's an argument. Are you mad is not a logical statement because it's a question. Logical statements have to be declarative sentences. You won't pass is a declarative sentence, so that would be a proposition. You won't pass because you haven't studied is a logical argument, right? You're moving from a premise to a conclusion. Why won't you pass? Because you haven't studied. Don't take this logic course is nothing, because it's not a declarative sentence. It's a command. Commands aren't logical statements, they're commands. Same with please be quiet. Please be quiet is just a command. A falsity so obvious that it couldn't fool a child is a term, right? Falsity is the term. So obvious that it couldn't fool a child all modifies falsity, right? You can see why you need a little bit of grammar knowledge before logic as well. But so falsity so obvious that it couldn't fool a child it's just a term. SpongeBob is real is a proposition. It's a premise. It ain't broke, so it don't gotta be fixed is an argument, right? You're going from a premise, it ain't broke, to a conclusion, so it don't gotta be fixed. So that's an argument. That's a full argument. You're weird is a proposition, right? It's a declarative sentence. It's saying something. Everything in the kitchen sink except the sink itself is a term, right? Again, in the kitchen sink except the sink itself, all of that is modifying the word everything. So that whole thing is a single term, a single kind of idea. Finally, ouch is nothing. Ouch is it's just an emotional expression, right? It's not a declarative sentence. You're not saying anything. Okay, so there is our introduction to logic. Again, if all the terms are true, if all the terms are clear and unambiguous, right? If the premises are true and instead of false, and if those premises naturally lead to the conclusion, then the argument must be valid. We'll continue from here next week. We'll start talking about fallacies, common fallacies that you find in rhetoric. You find when people speak or when people converse with each other to help us kind of understand logical thinking more. See you next week.